My daughter no longer wants to see me. Her words, a silent knife, cut through my heart. When love goes unrecognized, when sacrifices go unnoticed, is there anything that can awaken my daughter? And can the silence of a father make her realize that the simple things are the most precious in life? This is not a story about a broken family. It is a story of deep wounds, heartbreaking moments, and a harsh truth. Sometimes, the wounds are not what ultimately define us. In the early morning, when the faint rays of dawn gently filtered through the gaps in the old window, Delbert had already been awake for a long time, since the darkness still enveloped his small kitchen. The ticking of the clock in the living room echoed steadily, as if time never stopped. Despite the silence in this house, the kitchen remained the same, unchanged from the years he had lived here, except for the signs of time etched on every old object. The wooden table had faded, the armchair near the window had irreparable cracks, and the old refrigerator bore scratches from years of bumps and bruises. But it was these very things, imperfect as they were, that held countless memories, the lives of his family that had passed through them. Delbert was not in a hurry. To him, every early morning was a moment of stillness, a time to gather his thoughts, reflect on the past, and think about what lay ahead. The whole small kitchen seemed to stand still, in tune with his life, with nothing changing, nothing too noisy. The smell of coffee rose from the cup, spreading through the space, mingling with the scent of leftover toast from the previous night's dinner. Tiny dust particles floated in the air, forming a hazy mist in the gentle light of the morning. Delbert sat down on the wooden chair next to the dining table, his hand gently stirring the coffee, small circles swirling on the surface of the thick black liquid, but in his eyes, it seemed like he was staring at something far beyond reach. The family photo, old and faded, sat beside his coffee cup. Beatrice's hair, his daughter, in the photo was still soft, her gaze bright and innocent, as if she had never known worry. She stood beside his wife, the woman who had passed away too soon, but her image still lived in Delbert's memory, vivid and whole, as if it were yesterday. These memories, though faded by time, still remained sharp for him, as though he could feel every breath, every heartbeat of those moments. Delbert gently stroked the photo, his hand trembling slightly, not from age or exhaustion, but from the longing, the regret in his heart. That photo was the only trace left of a time when the family was whole. Now, as Beatrice prepared to step into a new chapter of her life, he felt an invisible distance growing ever larger between them. Beatrice, the little girl he had taught and cared for, was now about to start a new life with a man Delbert had never really understood. Leland, the man Beatrice loved, had all the things society called success. He had a stable job, a shiny car, and always appeared well-groomed and confident. But in Delbert's eyes, all of that still seemed insufficient. He couldn't believe those were the real values Beatrice needed in her life. He couldn't help but wonder if Leland would understand the beauty of the simple values that he and his wife had worked so hard to nurture within their family. Would he respect sincerity, patience, and what could be called unconditional love? Delbert sighed, looking at the now cold coffee. He didn't hurry to drink, just letting the flavor linger in his mouth. As a way to extend these moments, he couldn't bring himself to face Beatrice and say those words, couldn't tell her that he was afraid of losing her, afraid that she would step into a world he couldn't keep up with. He couldn't say that he worried she would forget the lessons he had taught her about love and simplicity. Every time he looked at Beatrice, he felt a gentle sadness, but deep, like a wound in his heart. But these words, these thoughts, Delbert couldn't voice them. His daughter now had her own dreams, her own hopes for life, and he couldn't force her to turn back to the past, couldn't hold her back. Yet, deep down, Delbert couldn't help but feel an overwhelming loneliness when he thought about her future. Would Beatrice still remember the lessons he had taught her? Would she find peace in a new life, where change and unpredictable challenges awaited her? The light outside the window had grown stronger, shining into the space of the old kitchen. Those rays seemed to want to lift the veil of silence, as if they were touching the memories that had been buried deep in Delbert's heart. He stood up, left the chair, and walked toward the window. The soft yellow light from outside illuminated his face, bringing the wrinkles into sharper relief, the marks of time he had lived through. But in his eyes, there was still a flicker of resilience, a hope, unclear but always present. Delbert turned to look at the family photo one last time. Beatrice, his beloved little girl, would no longer be the innocent child. She would be a grown woman, with her own life, her own decisions. But no matter what, he would always be her father. That bond would never fade. No matter how time passed, no matter how life changed, his love for her would never change. As long as Beatrice was happy, he would want nothing more. Even if her happiness was with Leland, even if she had to face hardships and challenges in her new life, he would always stand behind her, silently blessing his daughter. Because for Delbert, happiness was not some distant goal, but rather in these simple moments when he sat at the old table with a faded family photo and his quiet thoughts that he could never express to anyone. The morning came as it always did, but for Delbert, it was not an ordinary day. Every morning, he woke up before the sun rose, and each time, the surrounding space seemed to stop for a few seconds, allowing him to feel the chill of autumn mornings that had deeply embedded themselves in his memory. His small kitchen, although old and somewhat faded, held everything he cherished, from the wooden cupboard, which had worn with age, to the simple ceramic cups he always used every morning. Every object in this house seemed to have its own story, telling of the hard years he and his family had endured, and of a life he had built with simple things but filled with love. The first rays of the new day pierced through the window, casting a soft light over the old things in the house. Delbert sat at the wooden table, continuing with his usual routines. He poured coffee into his familiar cup, his hands trembling slightly as he stirred the spoon in the cup, closing his eyes to savor the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, the warmth spreading through the quiet space. But the peace of those moments was merely a facade. Inside, his heart was filled with anxieties that could not be easily dispelled. Delbert looked at the old family photo Beatrice had given him many years ago. The photo, which had faded over time, was still clear in his mind. Beatrice, his daughter, was smiling brightly in a pink dress, her innocent eyes shining, looking at him with trust, as if that little girl would never leave his side. She had once been a girl full of care and gratitude, but now, when looking into her eyes through her stories about Leland, Delbert felt an invisible distance between them, an inexplicable distance. Beatrice was no longer the innocent child he had raised and protected. She had grown up and was seeking new things in life, one of which was a man named Leland. Each time Beatrice spoke about Leland, Delbert felt a rising worry in his heart. She told him about the luxurious trips she and Leland had taken, the lavish restaurants where they enjoyed wonderful dinners, and the expensive gifts Leland had bought her. Beatrice's voice was full of excitement, which only made Delbert feel increasingly estranged from his own daughter. He couldn't help but wonder whether these things were what she needed to feel happy. Could expensive dinners and extravagant trips replace the simple family meals he used to cook for her when she was little? He couldn't help but feel that his daughter, though still loving him, was beginning to move away from the values he had taught her. Leland, the man Beatrice loved, was everything society considered successful. He had a stable job at a large company, a luxury car, and connections with powerful people, those whom Delbert only heard about through stories in the media. Each time Beatrice spoke of Leland, she always described him as perfect, someone she believed would provide her with a life of abundance and without lack. But in Delbert's heart, there was a contradiction he couldn't explain. He didn't feel the sincerity in Beatrice's stories about Leland. He could provide her with all the material things society deemed valuable, but could he offer her peace of mind, warmth, in love? Delbert couldn't stop worrying that Leland might provide Beatrice with everything society considered happiness, yet lacked the sincerity and connection between people who truly loved each other. With every story Beatrice told about Leland, Delbert felt more lost in his own thoughts. The tales of luxurious parties, expensive vacations, things that he could not connect with. He recalled the simple meals he and Beatrice had shared when she was little, meals full of love and warmth. He remembered when Beatrice was just a little girl, sitting next to him on the old wooden chair in the living room, listening to him tell stories about the family, about the struggles he had endured, but also about the simple joys of life. Those moments seemed so far away now, and he didn't know how to keep them from fading. He feared that Beatrice was being swept into a world where the values of family, of simple love, would have no place. He felt the connection between them gradually fading, not because she didn't love him, but because she had found a new world, a world he couldn't understand. Expensive gifts, lavish parties, luxurious vacations. Could these things make her happy for a while? But would they provide her with true happiness? Could they give her the peace of mind that Delbert had tried to create for her over the years? Each time Beatrice left the house, Delbert would sit in silence, watching her figure disappear behind the door. The emptiness in the house made him feel an odd loneliness. This house had once been filled with laughter, voices, and simple moments. But now, as Beatrice began to seek things out there, Delbert didn't know what to do to preserve the connection he had worked so hard to build. He didn't want to make her sad, didn't want her to feel blamed, but in his heart, the worry kept simmering, growing each day. Would Beatrice recognize the value of the simple things he had taught her, or would she forever be swept away by the flashy, glamorous things Leland could provide? Delbert sighed, looking out the window, where the sunlight began to shine on the leaves of the trees in the garden. In the soft light of the morning, he realized something important. No matter what happened, he would always be Beatrice's father. The values he had taught her, the simple moments full of love, would always be a part of her, no matter where she went or what she did. And he knew that, no matter what, his love for her would never change. The sun had begun to set, painting the entire space with a warm orange-yellow hue. In Delbert's small kitchen, the air still carried the familiar silence. The early autumn chill had begun to creep into the house, but it couldn't dull the warmth from the gas stove, where small flames flickered. The aroma of the chicken soup gently spread, mingling with the scent of fresh vegetables and familiar spices, bringing him a peace he hadn't felt in recent days. Delbert was a man of simple routines, things that never changed. Throughout his life, he had always been a family man, a devoted father, a faithful husband, and now, a solitary man in this kitchen. Although he was not a skilled chef, Delbert poured his heart into every family meal, into dishes he believed nourished not just the body, but also the family's bonds. Today, like every day, he was preparing a simple but nourishing dinner chicken soup with potatoes, carrots, and celery. This dish was simple and easy to make, but it was one of Beatrice's favorites when she was little. He stood by the stove, his eyes focused on the pot of soup. The flickering flames from the gas stove reflected in his eyes, as though he were looking into the past, into days long gone. Every dish he cooked carried memories of his family, of his wife and daughter, memories he would never forget, no matter how much time passed. The steam, rising from the pot, warmed the air around him, and the faint fragrance of the broth made him feel wrapped in a warm, peaceful embrace. Though the kitchen appeared small and old, it was where Delbert felt the presence of his family most clearly, even though his daughter Beatrice was no longer there to share these moments with him. As he stirred the pot of soup, a small mishap occurred. The lid of the pot shifted, and in an instant, the red sauce from the soup spilled out, splattering across the stove and onto the tiled floor. Delbert paused for a moment, then laughed at himself. His laughter echoed through the quiet kitchen, a natural response to the inevitable clumsiness. The red sauce stain spread everywhere, forcing him to quickly grab a towel to wipe it up, though he couldn't hide his embarrassment. Yet, he found it amusing. The clumsiness didn't make him angry. Rather, it made him feel a little relieved from the tension that had built up inside. Such moments had become part of Delbert's daily life. He knew that things were not always perfect, but sometimes it was precisely the imperfections that made life more interesting and lovable. His clumsiness, the times he spilled food, though it might dirty the kitchen or disrupt his calm in cooking, made him feel alive, something familiar and genuine. Above all, it was simplicity, a natural feeling, without worrying about perfection. Delbert bent down, cleaned the stove again, and smiled. He was not a perfectionist, but these moments brought him a special feeling when he realized that the imperfections were the most beautiful and honest thing. Over the years, he had learned to laugh at such small accidents. It was how he faced life, with all the things beyond his control. And though Beatrice was no longer here to see his clumsiness and laugh with him like she did in the past, he still felt her presence in every small moment. He remembered the days when Beatrice was little. She would often stand next to him in the kitchen, watching him cook, asking all sorts of questions about the ingredients and how he prepared the dishes. Beatrice always found joy in those simple things. When the soup spilled, or when he burned something, she would always laugh and say, "Dad, you're so clumsy." But in her voice was love, the family bond that he would never forget. His little girl was now grown up, preparing for her wedding and a new life. Moments like these had become memories, parts of the past he could not hold on to. Delbert turned to look at the 2 bowls of soup he had served. One bowl he would eat alone, the other he set aside for Beatrice. Though she might not be there to eat with him, he gazed at the soup, his eyes resting on the golden potatoes, the soft carrots, and the fresh celery floating on the broth. These dishes were not extravagant, nothing special, but they contained all the love he had for his daughter. Beatrice might not realize it, but for Delbert, each meal, no matter how simple, was a reminder of the love, the care he had given her since she was a child. It was something he could not express with words, but always showed through these small acts. As he sat down to eat dinner alone, with no one to talk to, no one to ask about his work, health, or those casual life stories, Delbert felt a soft sadness in his heart. The days passed, and although Beatrice still loved him, she had begun to step into a new life, a life he could not fully be a part of. These meals, though familiar in taste, were still missing her presence. He couldn't help but feel lonely. Even though the dinner was full and delicious, this kitchen was still where he felt the liveliness of his family, where he always returned to every day, but it no longer echoed with Beatrice's laughter and stories. Still, Delbert continued to cook these meals because he knew that no matter how much time passed, no matter how much she grew, got married, and started a new life, these simple feelings would never fade. He cooked because it was the only way he could show his love. Even if these meals seemed clumsy and imperfect, they contained everything he could do to maintain the bond between father and daughter. Delbert's house, though aged over the years, still held a simple, rustic beauty. The items in the house, though old, carried deep memories, serving as proof of a long time that had passed when the family was whole and happy. The wooden table, the old armchair, the wooden cabinets that had faded with age, these were all witnesses to a life of simplicity, but full of affection. Delbert never felt that these things were lacking, for to him, the value of an object wasn't in its appearance, but in what it held within memories and warm moments he had shared with his wife and daughter. Today, in this house, Delbert was preparing to welcome a special guest, Leland, Beatrice's soon-to-be husband. This was the first time Leland had come to the house, and Delbert knew this meeting was important. Though he didn't know much about Leland, through Beatrice's stories, he understood that he was a successful man, someone who had all that society valued: stable work, power, and a polished appearance. These were things Delbert could not fully comprehend, but he still tried to respect his daughter's choice. However, in his heart, a sense of unease lingered. Would Leland truly understand and respect the simple values that he and his wife had worked so hard to build for their family? Could he offer Beatrice sincere love, Or was he just offering the superficial glamour that Delbert could not grasp? When Leland entered the house, he immediately made a strong impression with his confident appearance. He wore a black suit, polished leather shoes, his hair carefully combed, and his bright eyes seemed to be scanning everything around him. He shook Delbert's hand firmly, his gaze polite, but Delbert couldn't ignore the way he glanced at the items in the living room. The small house, though not luxurious, was filled with memories, the place where his family had shared so many joys and sorrows. But to Leland, perhaps this place wasn't classy enough. His gaze, even if just a passing one, made Delbert feel like he was an outsider in his own home. Beatrice, though she noticed the difference between Leland and her father, tried to create a friendly atmosphere. She smiled and invited Leland to sit on the old sofa, while Delbert silently stood by, feeling like an observer from a distance. The chicken soup he had just made was steaming, but the atmosphere in the room had become more tense than ever. Leland began to talk about his work, the large projects he was involved in, and the meetings with famous people in his industry. His voice was smooth and confident, but it lacked the warmth Delbert had hoped for. Each word from Leland seemed to have a hard, protective shell, offering no glimpse into his emotions or genuine care. Everything revolved around success, numbers, and projects. Things that Delbert couldn't find joy or connection in. Delbert didn't want to show his discomfort, but the way Leland looked at everything made him feel an unbridgeable distance. The things around him, from the simple paintings on the wall to the old wooden table he still used every day, seemed to become outdated in Leland's eyes. His gaze stopped on the wooden table, and the light from the window highlighted the scratches on its surface. "Oh, this table?" Leland said, his voice almost mocking, though Delbert could feel a slight contempt in his tone. "I thought you'd have something more modern here." That comment felt like a slap in Delbert's heart. It wasn't a harmless joke. It was a criticism, though fleeting. The old wooden table was the thing Delbert cherished most in this house. It was an integral part of their family meals. Every scratch on it was a memory, a mark of the evenings spent with his wife and daughter, the mornings when he and Beatrice would sit together for breakfast, sharing small stories about life. This table wasn't just an object. It was the soul of the house, something he had cherished for so many years. And when Leland, with his perfect appearance, spoke like that, Delbert felt deeply hurt. Beatrice, hearing Leland's words, only smiled awkwardly. She didn't notice the hurt in her father's eyes. She just laughed along, trying to ease the tension, but it was a faint smile, lacking the sincerity Delbert once knew. She didn't understand that her father, in that moment, felt like an outsider in his own home, someone who couldn't fit into the world she was gradually entering. Beatrice, with her plans for the wedding and her new life, didn't realize that her father was standing behind, silently watching her, with all the worries and quiet love. Delbert tried to stay calm, but in his heart there was a profound sadness. He looked at Beatrice, looked at Leland, but in her eyes he no longer saw the pure light he once did. Her care, her stories about her future with Leland, had begun to replace the simple moments he had shared with her. The dinners together, the times she asked about his work, the small things in life, those were now part of the past. This feeling, this fear, Delbert couldn't express. He knew that Beatrice wouldn't understand his hurt, couldn't understand that just one careless comment from Leland had made him feel like he was being pushed out of her life. The wooden table, the table he had cherished for so many years, now seemed to symbolize the difference between two worlds, one of glamour and luxury, and the one of simplicity and sincerity that Delbert had preserved. The meal went on in awkward silence. Beatrice and Leland continued talking, but Delbert sat there, smiling, his eyes filled with a deep exhaustion that no one noticed. Throughout the dinner, he didn't say anything more, just quietly observing everything, watching his daughter as she moved into a life that he couldn't keep up with. The meal passed slowly, but without the comfort it usually brought. Delbert sat there, between Beatrice and Leland, but felt like a guest in his own home. The kitchen remained the same, the aroma of chicken soup rising gently, with the familiar sounds of family dinner still present, the clinking of spoons against plates, the rustling of pages, Beatrice occasionally asking Leland trivial questions, but amidst all those sounds, Delbert could not escape the sense of silence in his heart. It wasn't the usual quiet. It was a sense of separation, a loneliness he could not put into words. Leland, with his polished appearance and courteous manner, had immediately made an impression on Beatrice. He talked about his work, a prestigious job, the large projects he was involved in, the relationships with powerful people in his field. Each story of his was outlined with flashy words, descriptions filled with grandeur about success. Beatrice, sitting beside him, listened attentively, her eyes lighting up every time Leland talked about his business trips, his interesting meetings, and his personal achievements. She giggled when Leland spoke of the struggles he had overcome, but in that laughter, Delbert sensed something distant. That laughter was no longer for him, no longer like the days when Beatrice laughed at his stories about the hardships of their family. She was no longer the little girl who sat beside him, gazing at him with innocent eyes full of care. Each word Leland spoke, even the trivial stories, hit Delbert's heart like waves, making him feel left behind. He remained silent, not engaging in the conversation, only offering a small smile, his eyes fixed on the bowl of soup in front of him. Each spoonful he brought to his mouth felt like he was consuming the shattered memories of his own life, memories of a time when the family was whole, of meals where there was laughter and warmth. As Leland continued to talk about wedding plans, Delbert felt a heaviness in his heart. He didn't just talk about the details of the event. He also kept suggesting changes to the home that Delbert had lived in his entire life. After a while, as the meal neared its end, Leland suddenly spoke, as if it was an unavoidable suggestion in their conversation. "We should probably replace this table, shouldn't we? I think this one looks a bit old," Leland said, his eyes glancing over the large wooden table that Delbert had used for many years. Though he spoke gently, as if it were just a casual suggestion, in Leland's gaze, Delbert could clearly feel a hint of disdain. The wooden table, though not expensive or new, was something Delbert had cherished for many years. It was where he and Beatrice had sat and shared hundreds of meals, holding irreplaceable memories. But to Leland, this table was just an old item that didn't suit his style. Delbert slowly lifted his head, looked at the table, and then his gaze shifted to Beatrice. Leland's words had stung him deeply. But what hurt even more was Beatrice's agreement. She sat next to Leland, nodding and saying, "I think if we replace the table, the space will look nicer and more modern. Dad, what do you think?" Her voice was soft, yet full of enthusiasm, as if this were just a simple decision, nothing to worry about. Delbert couldn't answer right away. He pressed his lips together, trying to stay calm. To Beatrice, the question seemed like a mere discussion about decorating the house. But to him, it was a painful reminder that Beatrice no longer saw the values he had cherished. She no longer felt the importance of the wooden table, or the simple things he had tried to teach her over the years. Everything seemed to have changed too quickly, too far from what he could hold on to. Leland didn't even notice the hurt in Delbert's eyes. He continued talking about his choices, as though these decisions were the right ones that everyone should agree with. Beatrice, still looking at Leland, her eyes filled with love and joy, didn't see the distance in her father's gaze. She only smiled faintly, glanced at him briefly, then returned to Leland, continuing their conversation about the wedding and future plans. At that moment, Delbert felt an emptiness he couldn't express. He didn't just feel left behind by Leland, but also by his own daughter. The bond he had always kept seemed to be fading in Beatrice's eyes. She had grown up and no longer needed him the way she once did. She had someone else, someone she trusted and loved. And Delbert? He was just standing outside, quietly observing the changes in his daughter's life, unable to participate. At that point, the meal was left in awkward silence. Leland and Beatrice continued to talk, but Delbert felt like he was sitting outside their circle, like a lost guest in his own home. Everything had changed. The things he held dear, the things he had cared for over the years, no longer seemed to be valued. The wooden table, with all its value and meaning, was now just something to be replaced in Beatrice and Leland's eyes. Delbert couldn't say anything more. He just smiled faintly. But that smile couldn't hide the pain in his heart. He felt a deep void, as if he was slowly disappearing from Beatrice's life. He didn't know how to keep the connection with her, how to make her realize that what she was losing was not easily replaceable. But in that moment, all he could do was sit silently, watching his daughter drift away, feeling the loneliness spreading throughout the space. Time continued to pass, and Delbert couldn't help but feel as though he were standing alone in the house that once echoed with laughter and joy. The meals, the simple conversations, the days when Beatrice sat beside him in the kitchen, helping with small chores, all gradually became distant memories, out of reach. Whenever he tried to strike up a conversation, Beatrice only answered briefly, not truly paying attention. Each of her replies was hurried, sometimes just a short sentence, as if she didn't want to slow the pace of her life, a life that no longer saw him as an important part of it. Delbert couldn't help but notice the change. Beatrice had always been the closest to him. She had once been an innocent child, always seeking his protection and advice. But now, whenever he asked her about work, about her thoughts, Beatrice's responses were rushed, sometimes nothing more than polite exchanges. The old stories he once shared about life, about their difficult years, no longer seemed to have a place in her heart. Instead, Beatrice had only stories about the wedding, about the future plans she and Leland were making. Each time, Delbert felt like a stranger, no longer the person she needed to share with. Leland wasn't a bad man, but Delbert sensed something uneasy when he looked at the relationship between Leland and Beatrice. He was confident, refined, but the way he treated everything around him, from Delbert's house to the family's belongings, made Delbert feel judged, made to feel outdated. Leland might be successful in his own world, but could he offer Beatrice the peace she needed in life? Delbert couldn't stop worrying about it. And Beatrice, though she still loved him, still listened to him in the brief moments they shared, didn't realize the concern in his eyes. One day, after the meal had ended, Delbert remained seated in the room where his family had once shared so many happy moments. In the stillness of the house, he could only hear the ticking of the clock, the soft sounds that only highlighted the loneliness in his heart. Beatrice and Leland had left, and he was once again alone, like a silent shadow. He couldn't help but feel that, though his daughter was right there, in the very house between them now stood an invisible wall, a distance he couldn't bridge. Beatrice was no longer the little girl who sat beside him, asking simple questions about life. She no longer came to him to talk about the simple things, the family stories. She had her own world now, a world in which he couldn't participate. Leland had become the center of her life, and Delbert, no matter how hard he tried, was just an outsider. That night, as the house sank into darkness, Delbert couldn't sleep. He went out into the garden, where the flowers had begun to wilt, the yellow leaves scattered across the ground. He stood there for a moment in the darkness, gazing up at the starry sky, wondering if there was anything he could do to change the situation. He wanted to hold on to Beatrice, to bring her back to the warm days when she was still the little girl sitting beside him every night, listening to his stories, seeking comfort in his advice. But now, Beatrice had grown up, and he was left alone in a world of memories. Delbert went back inside and walked to the living room, where he kept the family's old mementos, the old photographs of his wife, the items Beatrice had made when she was young. All those were the only things left for him to hold on to the past. Among these mementos, he found a small wooden box where he kept the precious items Beatrice had made for him. One of them was a necklace she had crafted from beads when she was just a little girl. Though that small gift didn't have great material value, it was the most meaningful object to him. Every time he looked at that necklace, he remembered the days when Beatrice was still young. the days when she still needed him, the days when he was the most important person in her life. Delbert sat down on the old armchair, gently holding the necklace, watching the beads slowly fade with time. That gift wasn't just a keepsake. It was a symbol of the love and care Beatrice had given him. He remembered when she made the necklace, how she eagerly ran to show him, her eyes full of joy and pride. "Do you like it, Dad?" she had asked, and he had smiled, nodded, and said that it was the most wonderful gift he had ever received. He had worn the necklace every day, even though it had faded over time, even though it was no longer as beautiful as when it was first made. But to him, it was the most precious thing, the mark of the unconditional love his daughter had shown him. Looking at the necklace, Delbert felt a deep sadness in his heart. He understood that Beatrice had grown up, had her own life, and found love and stability in her world. But he couldn't escape the feeling of being left behind, forgotten in her decisions. He was no longer the first person Beatrice turned to when she needed help or shared something. She had Leland now, and he was left with only the memories, the old gifts, the traces of time that had passed. But in those mementos, Delbert found some comfort. Even though Beatrice had changed, even though she was no longer the little girl she once was, he knew that her love for him still lived in these things, in these memories. And though time might change everything, the sincere and simple feelings he had for her would always remain in his heart, like invisible threads connecting the past and the present. Day after day, Delbert continued with the small tasks around the house without ever complaining. His house was no longer new, but it was the place he had called home his entire life, filled with the memories of his family. Every morning, after waking up, he did the familiar tasks he had done for years, fixing the old armchair, watering the garden, or simply sweeping the floors. These tasks, for Delbert, were not a burden. They were how he maintained stability and peace in his life. One morning, as he held a small hammer to fix a wobbly chair, he felt as though he were reconnecting with things long forgotten, those simple things that seemed trivial but held deep meaning for him. Every stain, every small damage in the house was carefully fixed, not for anyone else but for himself, as a way to preserve a part of the past, of his family. This work, though simple, was for Delbert a way to feel useful, to feel needed. Certainly, no one noticed what he was doing. No one paid attention to the little repairs around the house. But to him, it was how he expressed his care and respect for his family. Over the years, the house had witnessed everything. The hard days, the joyful moments, the late nights when he woke up to care for his wife and children. And even though everything had changed now, he still persevered in doing these tasks, maintaining the routine in the house, as if he could hold on to a small part, even if insignificant, to keep the family connected. Meanwhile, Leland was a completely different character. Every time he came, it seemed as if the room was lit up. He was always impeccably dressed, his shirt neatly pressed, leather shoes polished, and a luxury watch always visible on his wrist. Every time he opened his mouth, it was a story about work, about success, about relationships with major partners, and projects he was working on. He could always talk about important meetings, about securing this deal, completing that project, and the way he told these stories made it impossible for listeners not to admire him. He was not only intelligent, but also very skillful in communication. Leland's stories easily captivated anyone, especially young people, those searching for a model of success. Leland always dominated every conversation. When he started talking about his new car, about important meetings in the past week, about how he ran a large company, Beatrice's eyes would light up as if every word he spoke was a life lesson she couldn't ignore. Every time Leland mentioned luxury travels or dinners with big investors, Delbert would sit there silently, listening to the flashy words of a world he couldn't understand. He wasn't just a successful man. He was also someone who drew attention. His stories, though glamorous and somewhat detached from reality, easily won the hearts of young people, especially Beatrice. She looked at him with admiration, those eyes no longer reserved for him. Delbert couldn't help but feel the growing difference between his world and the one Beatrice and Leland were building. While he only had simple stories about life, about old memories, about the things in the house, the worn-out chairs, or the old wooden table, Leland lived in a world where everything was new, glamorous, and full of wealth. Leland could talk about anything from big contracts to extravagant vacations. He had an irresistible charm, the ability to make people bow in admiration. No one could deny that Leland possessed natural intelligence and charisma, and for those who viewed life through the lens of material success, he was the ideal model. Delbert continued with his tasks, silently repairing things around the house that no one noticed, while Leland boasted about his wealth and powerful connections. Every time Leland spoke about the things he had, the expensive items, the big plans he was executing, Delbert could only stand there, watch, and listen, without being able to participate in the conversation. He felt like a shadow in his own home. The simple values he had preserved throughout his life, the things he believed would bring true happiness, now seemed outdated and out of place in the world Beatrice was stepping into. Leland, with all his charm and intelligence, easily dominated every conversation. He could always talk about relationships, successes, and the major projects he was involved in, making others admire him. Meanwhile, Delbert, with his patience, hard work, and daily tasks, slowly faded into the background. Though what he did was important, it was never noticed or appreciated. The chair he fixed, the plants he watered, the old items around the house, none of these were ever valued by Leland or Beatrice, even though they were the foundation of the family life Delbert had built. For Leland, his world was a world of power and material wealth. He could talk about expensive items, business trips, meetings with businessmen, and the large plans he was executing. Every word he spoke was wrapped in charisma, making those around him look at him with admiration. Meanwhile, Delbert, with his mundane, simple, and quiet work, couldn't compete for Beatrice's attention. Every time Leland spoke about his successes, every story he told felt like a knife to Delbert's heart, making him feel like he was just a part of Beatrice's past, a part no longer important in her present life. The contrast between Delbert and Leland became increasingly clear. Though Leland easily captivated people with his intelligence and attractive demeanor, Delbert couldn't help but feel that the values he had preserved for his family were the ones with lasting power, even if they weren't glamorous. Things like the old armchair, the plants in the garden, or the simple items he fixed every day might not earn instant admiration, but they were the things that kept his family steady over the years, a solid foundation that Leland couldn't see. Delbert sat silently in the corner of the living room, his old armchair creaking slightly under his weight, but he didn't feel uncomfortable. The only discomfort he felt was when his gaze accidentally landed on the wooden table, the item that had become an irreplaceable part of this house over the years. This table, with its light scratches and the marks left by time, had always been where his family gathered for every meal. Each meal in this house had been simple yet filled with love. Both his wife and Beatrice, even in moments of anger or dissatisfaction, would always set aside their differences when sitting together, laughing and sharing stories from the day before. But today, the table became the focal point of reflection between the past and the present. Leland, the man Beatrice loved, did not hesitate to comment on the old wooden table. He looked at it with a calm expression and then said, in a gentle but pointed tone, "This table doesn't match the modern space of this apartment. It looks a bit old and isn't anything special." Leland's words struck Delbert like an arrow right to the heart. It wasn't just a careless remark. It was a statement that the simple things, the belongings that had been part of the family for so many years, no longer held value in the world Leland was bringing Beatrice into. Beatrice only smiled faintly, but that smile no longer had the natural warmth it once did. It was forced, as if to avoid making things awkward. She said, "I think we should replace the table. Leland is right. This doesn't fit the new space in my house." Then, she turned to Delbert, looking at him as if waiting for agreement, but her gaze was no longer the same as it used to be. She didn't see, or perhaps didn't want to see, the hurt in his eyes. The pain wasn't from Leland's criticism, but from the fact that she, his daughter, was going along with him. The handcrafted gift she had once made for him from beads, which she had brought with bright eyes and pride, was now being dismissed as unimportant. Memories of the past flooded Delbert's mind. He vividly remembered when Beatrice first learned to ride a bike. She was so small, with awkward steps, trying to balance on the bike he had bought her for her birthday. He remembered how she couldn't ride without falling, her eyes filled with worry, and her tiny hands gripping his as he patiently held the bike steady. Each time she fell, he gently helped her up, told her not to be afraid, and encouraged her to keep going. And then, finally, she was able to ride on her own, balancing perfectly, and she exclaimed, "Dad, I did it!" In her eyes, he saw pride and joy that were indescribable. It was a moment full of love and hope, when she first accomplished something big in her eyes, and he was the one who helped her achieve it. It was in those moments, when Beatrice was still a little girl, that simple items like the bead necklace she made for him became symbols of pure love, of sharing, and of care. She spent time making that necklace one afternoon, when it was just the two of them at home. She sat on the floor, carefully stringing each bead onto the small thread, and then handed it to him with a bright smile and sparkling eyes. "Dad, wear this necklace," she said, her eyes glowing with joy from doing something meaningful for her father. Delbert wore that necklace every day, even though it had worn down, even though the beads had faded over time. It wasn't just a simple handmade item. It was proof of the deep love Beatrice had for him. That necklace was the link between them, a part of his memories of the happy, simple days. He never stopped wearing it, even if it no longer looked as beautiful as it did at first. But to him, it was the most precious gift Beatrice had ever given him. And now, as Leland and Beatrice sat together in the living room, talking about new plans for the house, Delbert couldn't help but feel the distance. The daughter he had once raised, cared for, now didn't recognize the value of the handmade gift she had made, and casually agreed to change everything in the house she had grown up in, even replacing the table he had used for years. Leland, with his modern ideas, his open disdain, viewed the simple items in the house as things unfit for the lifestyle he wanted to create. Delbert couldn't say anything. He just sat there, silently, watching them. In his heart, the memories of Beatrice when she was little rushed back, those days when she always needed him, when she sought comfort and love in the smallest of actions. But now, as she had grown up, the simple values he cherished were being overlooked, as if they were no longer important in her life. She no longer needed him the way she once did, and no matter how much he loved her, Beatrice's world no longer had space for him. A part of Delbert's heart ached. He couldn't deny that time had changed everything. Beatrice had grown up and found love in the world she was building with Leland. But he still couldn't let go of the memories of the little girl he had patiently taught to ride a bike, of the afternoons when she sat beside him, asking about everything in life. Those memories, though past, were irreplaceable parts of his heart. Looking at the old wooden table, looking at the mementos Beatrice had left behind, Delbert felt a strong change in her life. And he, despite trying to hold on to everything he cherished, couldn't change that. Everything had changed, and in Beatrice's new world, he was no longer the important part he once was. But to him those memories still remained, like priceless gifts she had given him. Delbert was not someone who liked conflict. The years spent in his family had taught him that sometimes silence and patience were the best ways to deal with difficult issues. He wasn't someone who sought confrontation or wanted to argue about the differences between himself and others, even though those differences often caused him pain. After remaining silent, witnessing the divide between Leland's world and his own, Delbert couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, but he decided not to react strongly. Rather than pushing everything to the brink of a confrontation, He chose a gentler approach, one that he hoped would help him understand his future son-in-law better. Delbert wasn't in a hurry, but it seemed there was something urging him to learn more about Leland. In their brief conversations, he realized that Leland had a strong confidence but also a certain closed-off nature that wasn't easily opened. The stories about work, power, and the social relationships Leland shared often made Delbert feel left behind. Although Leland never came off as rude, there was something about the way he lived and the way he viewed things that made Delbert feel alienated. This feeling wasn't hatred, but rather confusion, a recognition that their two worlds could never truly merge. One day, when Delbert felt something was off, he decided to take action. Instead of continuing to stay on the sidelines and observe, he chose to approach Leland's world not with criticism, but with curiosity and care. And so, he decided to visit the restaurant Leland managed. Leland had mentioned the place a few times, saying it was where he spent a lot of his time managing, one of his biggest projects that he was most proud of. Delbert knew this was an opportunity for him to learn more about his future son-in-law, without directly confronting the growing tensions in his heart. Although Delbert didn't like loud or lavish places, he thought that visiting Leland's world once would help him understand him better, and so, he decided to go, not to judge, but to observe, to feel. When he entered the restaurant, Delbert's first impression was one of overwhelm. The luxurious space, the soft lighting from the sparkling chandeliers, the polished wooden tables beautifully arranged, and the gentle music playing through the sound system. Everything was meticulously cared for, perfectly executed, with no detail overlooked. Although this was not a place Delbert was familiar with, he couldn't deny that the space exuded glamour, exuding success. This was Leland's world, a world Delbert had never participated in, but had always observed from the outside. Leland noticed him as soon as he entered, and smiled, his eyes shining. "Delbert, I'm so glad to see you here. Please, sit down." Leland led him to a beautiful table, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes. Delbert sat down, quietly observing. Leland was not just the manager here. He was truly the soul of the place. Standing among the staff, he directed everything swiftly and decisively, but also with warmth and friendliness. That evening, Delbert not only observed Leland from an unfamiliar angle, but also listened to him converse with the staff, handle difficult situations, and interact with customers. Delbert couldn't help but be impressed by the professionalism and confidence Leland displayed. But what was strange was that amidst this perfection, Delbert also noticed something stifling, a pressure that Leland carried every time he issued an order or delegated a task. As the dinner progressed, Delbert observed a subtle tension that Leland didn't try to hide. His eyes, though always smiling, held a deep fatigue in every glance. At that moment, Delbert no longer saw Leland as the perfect man with unwavering confidence, but as a man struggling with the invisible demands life placed on him. Once, when an employee spilled a bottle of water, Leland didn't raise his voice, but the tension was clear in his tone as he said, "This can't happen in our space. Let me handle this." But right after, Leland turned around, placed a hand on the employee's shoulder, and said softly, "It's okay. Just be more careful next time." This response surprised Delbert. Despite Leland's outward appearance as a successful, powerful man, there were moments when Delbert sensed a latent anxiety in every action he took. The more Delbert observed, the more he realized that, although Leland appeared to be someone always exuding confidence, he was also facing some harsh realities from his family and society. There was something weighing heavily on him, not just his own success, but the expectations of his wealthy family, which he seemed unable to satisfy no matter what. To achieve the success he boasted about, he not only had to please his business partners, but also live up to a pressure that could not be denied from the expectations of his family. Leland could stand confidently on stage and lead every conversation, but in some corner, Delbert saw the fatigue and burden he carried. Surely, Leland's world wasn't an easy one. Perhaps, he wasn't just fighting against material scarcity, but also an internal struggle, one to be recognized, to meet the expectations of those around him. These thoughts made Delbert sit still, quietly watching Leland, and wondering what he could do to help his daughter understand what truly mattered in life. Could Leland find real happiness in a world where he had to endure all these pressures? And would Beatrice ever realize that there were simple, silent values she had overlooked in her journey of growing up? Delbert wasn't sure of the answer, but he began to understand that everyone had their own struggles. Leland wasn't just a man proud of his material success. He was also someone burdened by great pressures from his family and society. Pressures Delbert had never experienced. It was at this moment that Delbert realized, instead of criticizing Leland, he could use his understanding to help him see a different world. A world where success wasn't always about winning at any cost, but sometimes it was simply about love and sharing. The next day, as the morning sunlight gently streamed through the window, Delbert had been awake for quite some time, as was his habit, deeply ingrained over the years. Every morning, he always began his day with simple tasks, habits he never changed, no matter what was happening around him. But this morning, the feeling inside him was more special than usual, as the events of the previous evening at the restaurant still lingered in his mind. The scene of Leland reprimanding the waitress, the tension in the air when he spoke up in her defense, and her quiet gaze of gratitude, these all made him reflect more deeply on the values he was trying to preserve in his life. As Delbert took the watering can and stepped into the garden, he couldn't help but recall the moment Leland suddenly lost his temper when the glass of water was spilled. The harsh words he directed at the waitress left him with an indescribable sense of unease. But the moment he spoke up, gently yet firmly, everything seemed to change. Leland didn't say anything more. He simply turned away. That feeling, like a small act of resistance, made Delbert realize that although Leland might be a successful man, always appearing strong and confident, he was just like anyone else. He was not perfect, and sometimes he needed to be shown what was right, the things Delbert believed were important in life. However, in Delbert's view, what mattered wasn't that Leland understood immediately. Change didn't happen overnight, but when he saw the waitress quietly thank him, a gentle understanding in her eyes, Delbert knew he had done the right thing. Compassion, patience, and the ability to understand others, even small actions, were the keys to unlocking great changes in the hearts of others. That was the only weapon he had, and in that moment, he understood that while he might not change Leland, at least he could help Beatrice see what was truly important in life. The dinner the night before had made Delbert think deeply. He didn't want to criticize Leland, didn't want to argue with him about things he couldn't change. But he realized one truth. Leland lived in a world where everything had to be perfect. Every detail had to be calculated. Every word, every action had to satisfy the unspoken demands from his society and wealthy family. But in that glamorous, powerful world, Leland had overlooked the simple things that Delbert cherished: the patience, the care for others, and recognizing a person's worth through kindness, not material success. Once again, Delbert felt himself standing between two worlds, one that he had spent his life building, and one that Beatrice, his daughter, was stepping into. He couldn't judge, couldn't criticize his daughter, but he knew she was being swept into a whirlwind she couldn't fully see. Beatrice was a smart and strong woman, but like anyone in her situation, she was drawn to what Leland could offer: a life full of glamour, financial freedom, and opportunities she couldn't refuse. But Delbert knew that life wasn't just about what could be seen and touched, but also about what couldn't be seen. The values that sometimes only become clear with time. While he continued doing his simple work, watering the plants, fixing things around the house, taking care of every blade of grass and flower in the garden, he felt as though he was waiting for a change in Beatrice's heart. He didn't need to speak much, didn't need to persuade her that Leland's world wasn't everything. He simply had to continue living according to the values he believed in, patiently and lovingly. One day he hoped she would realize. Beatrice had grown up, made her own decisions, but Delbert hoped that no matter where she went, she would never forget what he had taught her since she was little. That love is sincerity, not perfection. That understanding, kindness, and sharing are what truly make life worthwhile. One day, when Beatrice came to visit him, Delbert saw a shift in the way she viewed everything. She spoke of Leland with love and admiration, but there were fleeting moments of concern in her eyes. She was still caught between two worlds, unsure of how to find balance between what she had learned from him and what she was searching for in Leland. Delbert knew that even though she hadn't realized it yet, she would gradually come to understand that life wasn't always about achieving everything at any cost. Sometimes, stopping, listening, and understanding others was what truly brought peace to the soul. So, Delbert didn't rush. He continued living his life simple, patient, and always upholding the values he had taught Beatrice. He didn't need to change Leland's world or Beatrice's, but he hoped that through each small action, each act of kindness, he could help her realize that what truly mattered wasn't power or wealth, but love, sincerity, and kindness. And perhaps, one day, Beatrice would understand that the values Delbert had lived by all his life would always remain in her, helping her find true happiness in a world full of challenges and temptations. The party that evening was held at an elegant restaurant, with warm golden lights reflecting off the intricately carved wooden tables, where guests from various social classes gathered in the lively hustle of life. Leland, with his inherent confidence, was the host of the event, making the atmosphere even more sparkling. Everyone in the room couldn't help but admire him. From the stories about his work, his million-dollar projects, to the sharp financial decisions he had made. They laughed, they talked, they marveled, and they looked at Leland as the ideal model of success. Everything around him seemed to shine with brilliance, except for Delbert, who sat quietly at the corner of the table, feeling as though he were an outsider. Delbert looked around at the people, a quiet sadness in his heart. He didn't belong in this world. He didn't have glamorous stories about money, power, or success. Instead, he had simple stories about everyday tasks: fixing the old armchair, taking care of the garden, cooking meals for his family. Those simple things, to him, held all the value in life, a life that didn't need glamour, just love and quiet care. But in this room, where every eye was on Leland, Delbert felt like a shadow, someone who was no longer important in his daughter's world. As the evening continued, the stories revolving around Leland grew louder. The guests gathered around him, immersed in tales of big contracts, luxurious business trips, and lavish parties Leland attended. Every time he spoke about the financial decisions he had made, people laughed, praised him, and showed admiration. Delbert, in those moments, could only silently observe. These stories were not things he could take part in. He knew nothing about stocks, didn't understand financial markets, didn't have connections with powerful people. But he understood that, despite Leland's perfection in his world, that world still lacked something important that Delbert always believed to be the core of life: compassion. The party reached its peak when Leland, as usual, began to share stories about his personal finances, about the lessons he had learned from his failures and successes. His bright eyes and captivating voice radiated absolute confidence. But then, Leland suddenly turned to Delbert and, with a somewhat mocking smile, said something no one expected. "You taught me the most important financial lesson in my life. Never go bankrupt like you did," Leland said. His tone, light, but not without bluntness. The entire room fell into an awkward silence. The laughter from those around them seemed forced. Hasty smiles, as though everyone wanted to ease the tension. But that laughter only highlighted the sarcasm in Leland's words, and Delbert felt like he was being torn apart in that very room. Beatrice, though somewhat embarrassed, couldn't help but laugh along, as a natural reaction to her partner's words. She didn't realize that those jokes had broken his heart, not because he felt ashamed, but because he felt left behind in his own life. Delbert remained silent, unable to speak, because the feeling in his heart was too painful. His gaze fell on Beatrice, but the sadness in his eyes couldn't be hidden. The daughter he had nurtured and cared for since she was little was now siding with Leland. She laughed along, unaware that those words were not a harmless joke, but a public humiliation of him. It wasn't just a reminder of the financial struggles he had gone through in the past. It was a denial of everything he had taught Beatrice about the value of a simple life, of sincere love, patience, and compassion. Delbert looked at Leland, the man who he couldn't help but feel challenged by. Leland might be successful in this society, but his words revealed a lack of understanding and disrespect for the deep values Delbert had lived by all his life. Delbert couldn't understand why Leland would treat his past failures as a joke. Leland might not realize that it was in those failures that Delbert had learned valuable life lessons, that success doesn't always come from money or power, but from compassion, perseverance, and the love we give to our loved ones. A part of Delbert's heart felt a deep sorrow. He knew he couldn't change Leland, and he didn't want to. But he couldn't ignore the distance between him and his daughter, between Leland's world and his own. His whole life had been one of simplicity, hard work, loving and caring for his family with nothing but love. But in the world Beatrice was stepping into, those things seemed to no longer matter. Beatrice looked at him, but her gaze no longer held the admiration or love it once had. She didn't see the pain in his eyes, didn't realize that the values he had lived by all these years were slowly being left behind. She only looked at Leland with admiration, respect, and in her eyes, Delbert felt like an outsider in his own family. The light in the room seemed to no longer shine as brightly as before. Everything around him faded. The laughter of Leland and those around him only emphasized the silence in Delbert's heart. He couldn't change the truth that Beatrice had grown up, had chosen her own path, and in that path, he was no longer important. At that moment, Delbert didn't feel anger or resentment, but a deep sadness, a realization that he couldn't keep Beatrice from the glittering, sweet world Leland was offering. And though he still loved her, still wanted her to be happy, he also realized that she no longer needed him the way she once did. When Beatrice came to visit her father, she never imagined that this visit would completely change her perspective on him. On previous visits, when she came over, he always greeted her with a gentle smile, prepared simple meals for her, and shared little stories from his life. During those times, Beatrice hadn't truly understood everything her father had lived through. But this time, after the tense dinner with Leland, Beatrice felt an emptiness in her heart, a sensation she couldn't describe, as she realized she was slowly drifting away from her father, the father who she had always believed would forever be the center of her life. Delbert welcomed her as usual, but this time, there was a silence in his eyes that Beatrice couldn't ignore. She sat down, her eyes looking at him, but she felt an invisible distance between them. She couldn't speak, but the worry and unease rose within her as she sensed that her father was perhaps sad about what she had overlooked, sad about what she hadn't understood or recognized about him. Beatrice began to walk around the house, looking at the old items she had once been close to. The armchairs, the wooden table in the living room, the black and white photographs on the wall, all of them evoked memories of her childhood. But there was one item, an old wooden box on a shelf, that she had never noticed before. A box that was nothing special, just a simple old thing that her father always kept. Every time she came back to visit, he would show her the items in the house, the things he considered most valuable. But this time, in a moment of carelessness, Beatrice accidentally knocked the box over and it fell to the floor. She bent down to pick it up, curious, and opened the lid. Inside were several old items, yellowed photographs, and small pieces of paper with memories written on them. One of them was a faded letter, the handwriting still legible, though blurred by time. Beatrice picked it up, her eyes scanning. The words, "Thank you for saving our lives, Rescue Team 2003. She read it again, unable to believe what she had just seen. The letter was a thank you note from a rescue team, and it was clearly an important item to her father. She looked down, and beneath the letter was a dented helmet, its scratches clearly marking the battles her father had been through. A strange feeling took over Beatrice. She reached out and touched the helmet, feeling its sturdiness, and in her hands it seemed like a piece of the past she had never known. Her father, whom she had always seen as a simple, humble man who never complained about the struggles he faced, had once been a hero she had never known. A hero who didn't wear a cape or fight off villains, but one who quietly did great things, saving others without seeking any recognition. Beatrice felt stunned. She sat down in the nearby armchair, the one her father always sat in when reading the newspaper or drinking tea. She looked at the helmet, and a sense of regret overwhelmed her. For all these years, she hadn't realized that her father was not only the simple man she knew, but also someone who had sacrificed so much for others without ever complaining or boasting. What she knew about him were only the small tasks: his days in the garden, fixing things around the house, taking care of the family. But she had never seen that behind those actions was a man who had done great things, who had been part of a rescue team, saving lives. The memories of when he told her about the struggles in life, the times he worked hard to make a living, the times he sat beside the stove telling stories, now seemed like a faded picture. But with this helmet, everything she had known about her father became clearer than ever. Her father was not just someone who quietly cared for the family, but he had once been a hero, a man who had done things others would never dare to do. But none of this he had ever wanted her to know. He didn't need the praise or admiration. All he wanted was for his family to be happy, and for his sacrifices to be acknowledged in the smallest ways. Beatrice stood up, still holding the helmet, and looked around the house. She didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say. She felt like a stranger, someone who hadn't realized the true value of her father until it was too late. She realized that all these years, she had overlooked so many things. She hadn't seen the quiet sacrifices he had made, hadn't seen the simple values he had lived his life by, the ones he had passed on to her. She placed the helmet on the table, then looked at the old letter. She wondered how her father could keep all of this without ever boasting, without ever being proud. He had done all these things without expecting anything in return, only hoping his family lived in happiness and peace. Suddenly, a wave of strong emotion hit Beatrice, and she choked up. She knew that, although she had grown up, although she had gone far, her father's love and sacrifice had always been there, always the most important part of her life. But now, she realized what she had been missing, the understanding of the very man she had once loved. She was stunned by the silent sacrifices he had made for her, the things she had never truly understood. Beatrice silently promised herself that she would never again let her father live in the shadows of those unspoken sacrifices. She would try to change, try to live in a way that truly recognized the simple values he had passed on to her. And if there was one thing she could do, it was to start right now, to cherish the things her father had done for her, to learn from him about kindness, patience, and the silent love he had lived with all these years. Beatrice's wedding was not like any other. Although everything around her was sparkling, dazzling, and full of joy, for Delbert it was a complex event, quiet, and felt as though something both painful and full of hope was unfolding. The large room was decorated with white rose bouquets, warm yellow lights shining on the exquisitely arranged tables, and neatly arranged chairs, all enhancing the beauty of the ceremony. But for Delbert, the light was not the only thing that made the space shine. In his eyes, all the light was focused on Beatrice, his beloved daughter, though she was about to leave his life to begin a new journey, a new life with Leland. Beatrice, in her pure white wedding dress, walked down the aisle. Her steps were light and slow, but it seemed that each step carried with it a piece of memory, a piece of the past that she and Delbert had shared together. Every step she took wasn't just a move toward a new life, but also a step back into the past, a change in a life that had been so closely tied to her father. In that moment, Delbert couldn't help but feel that he was witnessing something deeply profound, but also filled with regret. Delbert stood at the end of the aisle, his eyes resting on his daughter, not rushing, not urging, but silently observing. Though his heart was filled with some sadness and concern, he didn't let it show. He had learned to control his emotions, knowing that, no matter how difficult things might be, he had to remain strong because this was his daughter's day. A day when she was stepping into a new chapter, a new door, one that he could not walk through with her. It was natural, something any father had to accept, but not everyone could do so easily. As Beatrice drew near, her eyes searched for him, not filled with joy or excitement like most brides, but with a look full of nostalgia, as if she were looking back at the years gone by, the memories she had shared with her father. Her gaze didn't shine with happiness or pride, but with emotion, regret, and deep gratitude. She knew that, no matter how much the world around her changed, no matter how she stepped into a new life, the values her father had instilled in her would always stay within her heart. She walked up to her father, each step seeming to stretch a long distance she had traveled. When she stood before Delbert, she gently took his hand, not because she had to, but because she wanted to tell him that she had realized everything that she understood, all the sacrifices he had made, all the things he had done for her throughout her life. She knew that, in this moment, there was no need to speak. Just the look in her eyes, just the gentle grip of her hand, was enough for Delbert to understand everything. For Delbert, Beatrice's smile at that moment wasn't just the smile of a happy bride. It was the smile of a daughter who had realized the value of the simple things, of the silent love he had given her. In that smile was gratitude, regret, and a deep awareness of the sacrifices she had never fully understood before. And that was all he needed. Not apologies, not lingering words of thanks, but understanding the realization of the value of what he had taught her over the years. Leland stood to one side, seemingly quieter than usual, observing the scene between Beatrice and Delbert. He didn't smile, didn't clap, didn't show the pride others around them might have expected. In his gaze, there was something complicated, not quite joy or worry, but it seemed that in this moment, he felt something he hadn't seen before: the bond between Beatrice and Delbert, the understanding they shared, something that he couldn't have with Beatrice. The sacrifices, the love, and the patience Delbert had shown, his daughter could not be measured by what Leland could offer her. These things couldn't be bought with money, nor replaced by anything. Beatrice and Delbert continued walking toward the altar, where the accent ceremony was taking place. As they drew closer, Beatrice looked back at her father once more, and in that moment their eyes met. No words were needed, no grand gestures, just the connection in their eyes was enough. A brief moment, but one full of meaning, because in that instant they both understood that, no matter how life changed, no matter which path Beatrice took, her father would always be the one to lead her, the one who stood strong beside her in the moments when she needed comfort. Delbert only smiled gently, his smile soft but filled with affection. He didn't need to say anything more. The years he had spent raising his daughter, the sacrifices he had made for his family, the lessons he had taught her about love and kindness, all of it was in the peace of Beatrice's eyes. That was all he could give her. She had realized it, and that was the most important thing. Beatrice turned back to look at Leland, her eyes still full of gratitude and awareness. Leland looked at her, then at Delbert, and in a rare moment he said nothing. He stood in silence, as though for the first time in all this time, he truly understood something about love, sacrifice, and the values that Delbert had lived with. And in that silence, everyone in the room, including Leland, realized that there are things in life that cannot be measured by success or material wealth. There are great values that only time and love can make clear. Beatrice took her father's hand, stepping forward, and in her heart, she felt lighter than ever. She had realized that, no matter which path she followed, no matter what challenges life brought her, her father would always be the one by her side. her steady source of strength. She didn't have to look elsewhere, because her father's love and sacrifice were the most precious things she could carry with her throughout her life. Delbert returned to his small home, where everything seemed unchanged. Beatrice's wedding was over. The laughter, the congratulations from guests still echoed in his mind. But now, the house had returned to its familiar silence. Every item, from the chairs to the tables to the dim lights, remained just as it always had been. But for Delbert, as he stepped into this house again, everything seemed to fade in his eyes, not because he didn't appreciate them, but because he knew that Beatrice was no longer here. She had grown up, stepped into her own life, and he, now alone, stood at a different threshold of life. He was not in a hurry, not rushing through the daily chores as he usually did. There were no meals prepared, no items to be repaired. Instead, he stood silently in the living room, where the family photos still hung on the wall. Each photo was a fragment of his life, capturing beautiful moments, sweet memories he had shared with Beatrice. But now, he saw those memories through a different lens. Everything in the house bore the marks of time and love, but for him, they felt like foreign objects. Because deep down, he felt that a significant part of this life had changed, and he had to learn to accept it. Delbert walked over to the desk in the living room, where the familiar items lay undisturbed. He picked up the family photo, an old black and white photograph, taken on a fall afternoon when Beatrice was young, holding his hand tightly, her innocent, carefree smile lighting up her face. That was a moment he would never forget. Beatrice was his greatest pride, his love, the reason he tried every day. Even though the photo had faded over time, it still preserved the innocence and unconditional love he had for his daughter. Next to the photo, he placed the beaded necklace Beatrice had made when she was little. Though it had worn out, to Delbert, it was a treasure. The small, simple beads were the first gift his daughter had ever made for him, and he wore it every day as a symbol of the pure love she had given him. It was a gift without words, not because of its material value, but because of Beatrice's sincerity, her desire to share a piece of her love. Every time he looked at the beaded necklace, he remembered the days when Beatrice was a little girl, moments when she looked at him with admiration and love. That was the love he would always cherish, no matter how she grew up and moved away from him. But when Delbert placed the dented helmet on the table, alongside the family photo and the beaded necklace, he noticed another presence in the room. Although the helmet was just an old piece of equipment, to him, it was not just a protective item. It was a testament to the rescue operations he had participated in over the years. It wasn't an easy job. It was fraught with danger, situations where he had faced death to save the lives of strangers. But the remarkable thing about this helmet was that he never boasted about what he had done. He did it out of compassion, without seeking recognition or honor. Every dent, every scratch on the helmet was a mark of silent sacrifice, actions that only he and those he saved truly understood. Delbert sat down on his old armchair, the same chair where he rested every evening after a long day. The last light of the day streamed in through the window, making the objects on the table shine. Each item, each possession, carried with it a story, a memory, and a part of his life. He looked at the helmet, the beaded necklace, and the family photo, and felt an unusual peace. He didn't need praise, he didn't need thanks. The values he had lived, the sacrifices he had made, had become a part of this life, and that was something he was proud of. Although Beatrice had entered a new life, although she no longer needed him the way she once did, Delbert did not feel pain or regret. He knew that, even though he might no longer be the most important person in Beatrice's life, the values he had taught her would always remain in her heart, helping her face challenges and find happiness in her life. These values were not things that could be measured by wealth or power, but things simple yet enduring, things that time could never erase. Delbert sat there, relaxed, letting his thoughts flow like gentle ripples in a pond. For a moment, He felt the silence of this space, so different from the noise of the world outside. This was a space of tranquility, where he could find peace in his heart. Though there was no recognition or glory, he felt content with the life he had lived. The silent sacrifices, the love without words, the simple but steady values, these were what made up his life. He smiled gently, not a smile of pride, but a smile of a man who had lived fully with the things he believed in. It was a smile of acceptance, of love, of peace within his heart. Delbert understood that, though time passed, though everything changed, those values would always remain, because those were the most important things in this life, not wealth, not power, but love, silent sacrifice, and the small but meaningful actions we take for others. And so, Delbert sat there, in the silence of his home, realizing that his life, though without the glamour or great recognition, was the most precious life of all. The values he had lived by would never fade, and that was the most valuable gift he could give to Beatrice, to himself, and to the world. Finally, Delbert entered the quiet moment of his life, where the wounds had healed and the silent sacrifices no longer needed recognition. He understood that, although life had many challenges, and love or sacrifice might be overlooked, it is the simple moments and perseverance in silence that truly create real value. While Beatrice had found her new happiness, Delbert had achieved a peace that not everyone can find, peace within himself, in unconditional love, and in acceptance. The story of Delbert and Beatrice is not just about family conflicts or the changing values of life. It is a healing journey, about how each of us, even after stumbling or making mistakes, can learn to reassess what truly matters in life. And sometimes, all it takes is a moment of understanding, a small act of love, to create a great change. Perhaps, like Delbert, we all have times when we feel forgotten, but then realize that true value lies not in external recognition, but in the sacrifices and love we give to others. Do you have any healing stories of your own? Moments that helped you change the way you see life and your loved ones? Share your thoughts in the comments. Because sometimes, your story can be the light that helps someone else find peace in their own heart.